Good evening. Welcome and welcome again to African News Review, our weekly conversation where we take a look at the coverage of Africa in the Western media and deconstruct the stories. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and with me, as usual, from the grounds of Howard University, is a journalist and publisher, Blackstone News, author of Manufacturing Hate, how Africa is demonized in the Western media, and he is none other than Comrade Milton Allimadi. And good evening and welcome.
Santa Sana. Thank you.
Yes, in the weeks after the elections you've had, and there has been elections all over the continent, and the latest serving has thrown up quite a curveball. And for that, we go to Botswana. And it reads, bear me a second, I'll share my screen. It reads from the New York Times, and it goes in. Young African voters saw on the parties that have ushered in liberation. Political parties that have governed for decades since African countries overthrew colonial rulers are now being challenged by frustrated young voters. The story is filed by John Elligon and Yvonne Muka. The resounding defeat this past week of the only political party that has governed Botswana since independence 58 years ago sent tremors across the African continent. A spirited young population has, over the past year, disrupted old guard liberation parties that have been relying on their credentials from the days of fighting colonialism to stay in power. This strategy seems to be losing its effectiveness as young people become a larger share of the electorate on a continent where the median age is 19, the youngest in the world. And it goes further. Many young Africans say they care less about how much a politician suffered fighting colonizers and more about whether these politicians are stealing public money, providing jobs, and respecting basic freedoms like free speech. It is fine for governing parties that grew out of liberation movements to hold on to their history, but we cannot be holding on to that history when we are doing wrong, said Lindiwe Zulu, a member of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress in South Africa. Comrade, your initial assessment of this new development.
No, it's good. I mean, people need to elect the people that represent them in parliament,
Okay.
at the national executive level, as prime minister or president. So I'm all for it. It's 100% good. I think the European media, whether it's Europe, United States, the white control corporate media, are celebrating prematurely. Because if you read the headline, it's almost as if they are repudiating the fact that these people fought for and won, even though it's only symbolic independence for their countries. No, on the contrary, they're saying that now that we are supposed to be independent, why are we not delivering on the goods that an independent country should be enjoying? So that's how the election should be analyzed.
Okay.
And, you know, the youth, and it's about time, I think these elections, but maybe, but not so much Botswana. Botswana has been managed. So Botswana is not the excellent example. Botswana has been managed relatively quite efficiently and had many African countries function like Botswana. The problems that we have in Africa would not be as severe. Botswana only started experiencing financial economic problems the last couple of years because of the diminished returns from diamond proceeds from diamond.
Yep.
Otherwise, Botswana managed its diamond industry 100 times better than Nigeria managed its oil industry, for example. As a result, Botswana, whose per capita income was lower than Nigeria's in the 1960s, is one of the highest per capita income in Africa right now. But overall, I'm totally in support of leadership change. coming from a country like Uganda, as you know, where we've had one fascist dictator for 38 years in power. We have countries like Eritrea. I don't even know how long it's been there. I think it's been there since 91 perhaps.
91, yeah. 91.
And then we have Paul Biya in Cameroon, 42 years and wanting to run for another term, even though people are not sure whether he's alive or not. This is crazy. So obviously, these are the kind of developments we need in African countries. And had many of them not been manipulating elections outcomes, many of them would have been gone a long time ago. So this is good news.
Okay, so putting a wrench in that progressive spirit, would it be right in suggesting that the youths do not lose sight of the history that grounded most of these countries? Because it's one thing to say, oh, you're not getting the trappings of vis-a-vis 2024, but to lose sight of the fact of what it is those liberation movements were about in the first place and totally discard them. Because I would read into what the New York Times is a bit celebratory about the fact that the old guard has been tossed out,
Yes,
thinking
of
the
course.
youths will be much more malleable.
Right.
Yeah. So what do you think?
Of course, that's what they're saying. And that's why I'm saying they're celebrating prematurely, because the same young people who come into power are going to see that they're going to be subjected to the same conditions that all these African countries have been subjected to since so-called independence, beginning with Ghana in 1957.
Yep.
They're going to find out that they're not allowed to industrialize. They're not allowed to produce manufactured products. In the case of Botswana, fortunately, it signed some deals over the last few years, and it has been able to cut some of its diamonds domestically, creating more jobs. But a country like Sierra Leone, for example, does not cut its diamonds. So they take the diamonds, these huge, big stones, and they create jobs for people in Europe and Israel, where the diamond cutting industry is located. So whether it's Botswana, whether it's Senegal, where they had the elections, of course, some months ago, and they elected a young leadership in Senegal.
Yep.
But in Senegal, the young people who actually swept to power are conscious. In fact, one of the reasons why they were swept to power was because they were arguing against the French neo-colonial control over the economies.
Correct.
So
Correct.
I don't know the direction or the policies of new party in Botswana, but I know at least in Senegal they realize that the economic hardship they experience is because of neo-colonialism. So they're determined to change this relationship. And whether the ones in Botswana have acknowledged that or not, they're going to find out that they will need to adopt the same kind of approach that the young people in Senegal are doing. Because unless you change that and you use your own natural resources to create jobs within your country and to manufacture and to industrialize, 20 years, 30, 40, 50 from now, we'll be in the same position that Africa was in when they won independence in the 1960s.
Okay, so judging by the coming to power of two largely young political engines in Senegal and Botswana, as the case might be now, one coming into a fairly settled economy, which is in the case of Botswana. In the case of Senegal, you have one that is trying to sweep away the stench of neocolonialism. What would that act as a vehicle? How would that act as a vehicle to the youths on the continent? I hope I'm not repeating myself now. In terms of, okay, how do we go about, is it too early to look at those two as examples of, those two cases as example of how to proceed, or it is let's get into the ocean and just start swimming, because literally we're drowning as it is.
No, it should inspire them. In fact,
Okay.
I think if we don't see change in Uganda either before
Mm-hmm.
or in the next elections, which I think is 2026, I think this time, if they go through the electoral process, if those elections are stolen, I see this time that they might have sustained protests, nationwide protests,
Okay.
to take down the dictatorship in Uganda. And I would not be surprised if that is suppressed violently, that it could also actually inspire a violent reaction to bring down the dictatorship in Uganda. I think the youth in Africa, they've reached their limit. I think they saw inspiration from the election in Senegal, where a president who had tried to extend his term by manipulating the constitution, but Senegal has a very advanced civil society organizations, you see? So they were able to organize and mobilize and resist very effectively. Even though the leadership was arrested and detained, they
Yep.
were still able to mobilize, even from their detention,
Yep.
and to sweep that government
Into
away.
power.
We saw the protests in Kenya, you know, because the young people in Kenya had also reached their limit, you see. Now in Kenya, it did not bring down the government, but the government had to back off on some of these tax initiatives.
Yeah, with the finance
Now,
bill.
meaning going forward, they're going to have to accommodate the voices of the young people in any policies that they enact, any decisions that they make. So, and I like the point that you mentioned, the question of the history. And the question of the history, if they don't know the history, you cannot blame the young people, because when you teach the history, you can't just say, oh, we got rid of the Europeans. These were colonialists. You have to explain how the Europeans were preventing your country from progressing, from developing. And you have to explain how they kept you in this marginalized and dependent economic position and what needs to be done to change that. But what have you been doing to change that? You see? And that's why
Yep.
they don't teach that part. They
Yeah.
don't teach that part because they have not really been effective in changing the economic relations. So they just say, oh, these white European imperialists who thought they were superior to us had been ruling us and we kicked them out. That's not enough, right?
You have to
That's
tell
all
them
well
why.
and good,
Yeah.
but how is that
Yeah.
going to feed me today? You see? And that's a missing connection with the history. And I see why they don't teach that part. Because in terms of transforming the economic relations, they were not able to accomplish that.
Okay. Speaking of history, there is a new book out. It's titled Revolutionary Movements in Africa, An Untold Story. Maybe that might be the beginning of people learning about what transpired and how we got to where we are today. And
Yeah.
so, you were going to add?
Now, I was going to say, unfortunately, we don't have many parties, right, that are mass movement type parties today
Okay.
in African countries. The mass movement parties were created in the 1950s, in the 1960s, to mobilize the masses in massive numbers. The Europeans saw that and said, you know what, we cannot stand in the way of this. We have to yield. And independence came, right?
Yep.
So today, to try to organize mass movement parties, first of all, you're going to be locked up. You're going to be locked up because now we have the Africans who want to, the elite, the African, unproductive bourgeoisie. I say unproductive because they don't create jobs, they don't innovate, they don't produce, they just live off rent.
Rent, yes.
Yeah, by having, by sucking up the surplus from fellow Africans, whether they're farmers, whether they're, public,
N-
civil employees.
Natural resources.
Exactly. Natural resources, they take their cut, Mr. 10%, that terminology, right? So as a result of that,
Mm-hmm.
we really don't have mass movement parties,
Mm.
right? We have parties that have minimal representation.
Mm.
So
Mm.
if you have a party in power, right? If an opposition party is allowed to operate, that party structurally is probably very similar to the one that's in power. They just want their turn, to eat, right? They want their
Yeah,
turn to eat. They're
that's the
not
popular.
transformative.
Mm.
They're not saying these are the kind of policies we're going to enact.
Mm.
You see, that's the only part where you hear them say they're going to be different than the party in power. They're going to say, "Oh, we'll stop corruption. We will not be stealing," right? But it's impossible to stop corruption without increasing production. You see, because you come there, you're in power, and then you find, okay, the resources are limited. So how are you going to prevent the members of your party that brought you to office, whether you, the leader yourself, you're a person of integrity, right?
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to stop the membership from stealing if you're not expanding economic production?
Mm.
See?
Yes. And from one election, we go out to the fallout of another. The recent election in the United States, African leaders are now sort of bending the knee, as it were. And the next one comes from Radio France International, RFI. Trump's re-election stirs up hope and doubt in Africa. African leaders have been quick to congratulate Donald Trump on his re-election, expressing optimism for a stronger partnership with the United States. Yet analysts suggest Trump's next 4 years are unlikely to bring significant change to the US-African relationship, with many expecting the return of a transactional approach to diplomacy. And it goes further. Following the election results, leaders across the continent extended their well wishes to the returning US president. I look forward to building on our mutual trust, said Kenya's President William Ruto, while Nigeria's Bola Tinubu voiced hope for a reciprocal area of cooperation over the next 4 years. However, many observers believe that Africa, previously labeled by Trump as a continent of SO countries, remains a low priority for the United States. Historically, the US foreign policy has largely neglected Africa, focusing instead on countering adversaries like China and Russia. In contrast, President Joe Biden promoted Africa as a vital partner, though little was executed during his mandate. According to the International Crisis Group, Morita Mutinga's in Nairobi, Trump is a committed isolationist and clearly wants to pull back from global commitments. Mutinga told AFP that Africa has often been viewed by the US as a problem to be solved, in contrast to China's more investment focused engagement on the continent. Your take, sir.
All right. So first of all, I'm not hearing a lot being said. He's saying that Trump is isolationist focused, right?
Mm-hmm.
If isolationist means we don't have a NATO destroying a country like Libya, which happened under a democratic administration, then I would prefer that isolationism every time, 100%.
Okay.
We have Congo is burning up, right?
Yep.
During a democratic administration. We have Sudan is burning up during a democratic administration in the US. We have Cameroon has been burning up for decades.
Mm.
We've had democratic administrations, republic administrations. France, which is no longer a global power, is still allowed to let Cameroon continue to burn because it satisfies French interests and French companies.
True.
We have
Zimbabwe.
we have North Africa, even West Africa, Central Africa burning up because of the destruction of the Libyan state during a democratic administration. So, what potential, much more grave danger could Trump present to Africa that we have not already seen, either between a democratic or Republican administration? Of course, we are all appalled and outraged that he would dare, refer to Africa as a collection of asshole countries. That's outrageous. That's pure, outright racism. But then on the other hand, he may be articulating verbally what many of them feel internally anyway. You see? Now, by having said that, is he going to launch an attack on African countries? Is he going to deprive any benefits from the United States that any African country is now benefiting from? Those are the issues that we need to look at. And I submit that he's a detestable human being. He's going to be destructive in very many ways
Internally.
in the United States
Yeah.
regarding U.S. relations with Africa. I'm not sure that any other president could do any worse than what we've seen over the last few years. So that's my position. I think what we need to do is this. We can't allow the narrative to always be written by others. See?
Okay.
We need to look, are there potential opportunities for Africa during a democratic as well as a Republican administration? Because if a Republican president wins in the United States, you're going to have to continue dealing with them anyway.
True.
U.S., the global power, has its military deployed all over the world, all over Africa. The U.S. controls the World Bank and the IMF and many private banks that have resources. How are you going to address those issues going forward? You see? Now, of course, we have the issue with BRICS as well. BRICS, depending on how things go, could become like a potential game changer, because what's really been holding back Africa is having access to financing that will allow these countries to industrialize, to use their raw materials, use them in factories within Africa, create skilled jobs within Africa, skilled, relatively higher paying jobs. And this expands the economy. And this puts some pressure, at least in not really eliminating, but reducing corruption. Because corruption, you have to be very careful when we say corruption in African countries, right?
Yep.
If there's no production, right? If a policeman is not getting paid livable wages, you don't think he's going to ask you for extra tea to allow you to go past a roadblock? If a soldier is not being paid livable wage, you don't think he's going to allow you, ask you for extra tea? Employees at the airport, where people talk about, oh, I was so shocked. I got to the airport in this African country, people are asking me outright for bribes just to carry my bag from here to there and all that stuff. We've had all those stories, right?
Yeah, very much.
But we also have to be realistic, before we are too judgmental sometimes without looking at what's going on. Africa's share of global trade is about 3%. Let's think about that.
3%.
3%. The continent has all the resources. Young people, we see the video images ourselves on TV, drowning. Who likes to drown? Who likes to die? Nobody likes to drown. Nobody likes to. And yet they keep repeatedly doing that because there's no production. They're not earning a living. So they're willing to even take risk of losing their life in the hope that if I cross the Mediterranean, even if I sweep the streets somewhere, I'm going to have some salary, some wages rather, to buy for food. So then so in a situation like that, obviously there's corruption. There's massive. The ones I would characterize as the corruption, essential corruption, is when the government officials, when the elite, they take their cut from these multi-million-dollar deals. You see, they embezzle state funds and resources, but somebody just trying to survive on the streets, I would not really characterize that as corruption at all. That is survival. But it all comes back to the economy. You're not producing. So that's why nobody should be surprised that when people are allowed to vote, and if the elections are not rigged, of course, every sitting government today in an African country would probably be voted out. You see? Maybe 9 out of 10 would be voted out if the elections are not rigged.
Based on incompetence.
Absolutely.
Based on incompetence. Yes. We've come to the halfway point, and we have to ask our viewers, please support this channel. Do subscribe. We're aiming to get to 1,000 subscribers before the year runs out. And again, would urge you to bring a friend. If you find value in what you're watching, do hit the like button, bring a subscriber, bring one along. And to add to what Brother Milton was talking about with regards to the American policy never really changes with regards to whoever the party is in power in Washington. There's a book written by Vijay Prashad titled Washington Bullets, A History of CIA Coups and Assassination. There it goes in depth into what the American policy looks like on the outside. And again, from Vijay Prashad, a book actually recommended by the good comrade himself, Vijay Prashad, The Darker Nations, A People History of the World. It gives you a in-depth analysis of how the movements in the past have come to be formed, like the non-aligned movements, and which is a foreshadow for BRICS, of how the people in the lower South can engage with the Western hegemony and, carve out a place for themselves. China has done it. Singapore has done it. It's high time other countries. Nigeria has twice the population of Singapore. There is no reason why Nigeria should be in the doldrums economically, politically, and what have you. So, any last words on this story?
Well, okay, so I'm glad you brought up Nigeria and you made that comparison.
Yeah.
If people go back, before oil became the major product, Nigeria was producing agricultural commodities.
Yep.
Botswana is semi-arid. So in terms of agriculture, there's not so much opportunity. There's a lot of cattle production, right?
Yep.
So there was a major beef industry. I don't know how that was impacted by diamond. But the danger is always that we don't have a far-sighted economic policies, because often you need the money immediately. You see?
Yep.
It's hard to forgo money. See what I'm saying?
Yep.
So you have oil. You want to focus on selling oil because it brings you revenue relatively quickly. You ship it, you're paid for it. You see? So you end up neglecting agriculture. Right? So you need a balanced type plan for balanced growth. You see? You need to know that you're going to get this amount of revenue from oil, this amount from diamond, this amount is going to be spent, this amount is going to be saved. If you need to subsidize agriculture, right? Because now you've been focusing on these, what they call the extractive industries, then you need to do that so that you're still producing your own food. You're not becoming dependent on food exports. So I think that's also has been a major problem for Nigeria. You see, focusing too much on oil, and then because of mismanagement, not being able to save all that windfall, which could have been realized from oil. A lot of the money, as you know, was stolen. There were some leaders in Nigeria who were stealing even billions of dollars. So can you imagine if Nigeria had managed its resources,
Mm.
efficiently? Nigeria would be a global power, today.
Mm. Mm.
But it just shows that we still have the blessing of the resources. We need good leadership. We need good leadership so that the resources can become a blessing for our people and not a curse, and
I
a
mean,
blessing for people overseas, you see.
you said that just to buttress the point with regards to Nigeria's waste of resources. There was a book a couple of years ago, almost like 7 years ago now, titled "The Oil." I think it's "The Oil Riches of Africa." Yeah, and in the book, it breaks down the loss Nigeria accumulates every year. We're not talking about oil now. A byproduct of oil exploration is gas. Nigeria has been flaring its gas since it found oil in 1956. So put into that idea that, according to that book, using conservative estimation, says Nigeria has been flaring gas at the cost of about $1 billion every year since 1956 that oil has been discovered. So Nigeria is now 63 years old. Just add the numbers. A 63 billion up in smoke. So the mind boggles. But then if you bring that up, it would be a question of, this, that. But that is 63 billion that could have gone to a host of people-centered activities. But we move on. And to the next, speaking of information, we go to West Africa, we go to Radio Deutsche Welle for the next story. And it's titled, How West Africa is Fighting Disinformation. The story is filed by Nicholas Fisher and Zanem Netizaide. Disinformation on West Africa's social networks is surging, particularly in the coup-hit Sahel region. This has serious consequences for the daily work of journalists. West African countries have become prime targets for social media propaganda campaigns. In the Sahel region, disinformation on social networks have nearly quadrupled in the last 2 years, according to research and studies by the African Center for Strategic Studies, Amnesty International, Reporters Without Borders, and the Nigerian online medium, L'Evenement. According to the African Center, it says, an academic institution within the U.S. Department of Defense, almost 60% of campaigns are sponsored by foreign states, often pushing an anti-Western discourse in favor of Russia. This is a quote coming from Bilal Tahir. We know Russia's attitude towards the EU and the US, said Bilal Tahir, coordinator of the African Verification Alliance. There is a wave of anti-Western sentiment, so Russia is taking advantage of this fertile ground. The media battle intensified in 2020, shortly before the Wagner Group appeared in Mali. Your initial assessment before I continue. I don't even know what to say.
If you're going to do a propaganda piece, you should do a better job. The minute you quote an
official in the U.S. Department
of Defense.
Thank you very
much. Are the editors really that incompetent, that they couldn't even say, okay, let's quote everybody else except that entity. And then the story can still fly. So you think readers are so stupid that you can tell them, oh, this is propaganda. In fact, we are quoting information from the U.S. Defense Department. Come on now.
I don't know who
you think the readerships are going to be mostly Africans. Africans are not that stupid, my friends. It's mind-boggling how dismissive and paternalistic they can be in their propaganda. So they're talking about pro-Russia and pro-China propaganda and attacking it with propaganda. And actually, worst of all, admitting that this is propaganda.
Exactly.
Once you're an entity that's a part of the Department of Defense. Yeah, it's preposterous, you know. It's
Okay.
nobody's denying that there's Russian propaganda, there's Chinese propaganda. What they're trying to imply is that there's no Western propaganda.
Uganda,
You see?
exactly.
That's the
Exactly.
most
But
preposterous
we don't
part
do
of the
it.
story. Had they, a smarter editor would have said, listen, I like this story, but I want you to also mention here and there that yes, the West have also been accused of propaganda. However, that propaganda is not as destructive as pro-Chinese or pro-Russia propaganda. And then people can debate that, you see? By not even introducing that element, you know, you're really exposing yourself to ridicule. This is exactly what I'm saying they're exposing themselves to absolute ridicule. Before they destroyed the Libyan state,
Yep.
you know, in 2011, leading to the destruction of one of the most powerful economies in Africa,
Yep.
you know, leading to mass chaos. Now Libya is a complete failed state today,
Yep.
leading to the death of Gaddafi, and claiming they were going there to rescue Libyan civilians by bombing 24/7 for 10 months, right? They killed many, many times more Libyan civilians than Gaddafi had ever killed during his entire reign, you know, in Libya. And all the media outlets, you know, the so-called mainstream media,
Media.
but I don't call them mainstream because that gives them credibility, right? The corporate establishment media, everything that they were publishing was propaganda, correct? Propaganda on a massive scale. The same Gaddafi that they had been praising because they destroyed the country's nuclear program. He started opening up Libya's economy,
Oil
the
industry.
West.
Yeah.
Remember, people like Tony Blair even ran there, right?
Went to meet
All
him in the
these prominent
desert as
Western
well.
folks started engaging with Libya.
Yep.
The same Libya, once you start attacking it in 2011, is a complete pariah. You know, see how they switch into the propaganda mode. So they really have no credibility doing any story about propaganda in Africa, pro-Russia or pro-Chinese propaganda, you know, without admitting that they, for the West, engage in massive propaganda in Africa as well.
Okay. Let me continue. Okay. So at the same time, Facebook shut down 3 influential online networks on its platform, 2 of which were linked to Russia. You could read messages like "Goodbye France, welcome Russia," said Dmitry Zverev, journalist and member of the open source research community that investigate the movement of Russian paramilitary Wagner Group. And the country seems to be achieving its goal. Russia has managed to influence public opinion in countries such as Mali, Burkina Faso in its favor using dishonorable means. What does that mean?
Well, I already elaborated their dishonorable propaganda in destroying Libya. That's what it means to me, you know? You see, here's the problem. And this is, I think, the only value we can add, really, to our sisters and brothers engaged in journalism in Africa. Do not yield to Russia propaganda. Do not yield to Chinese propaganda. And certainly do not yield to Western propaganda. What they're trying to suggest to you is that they don't engage in propaganda. So be wary of Russia and be wary of China. I'm telling you, be wary of all of them. All of them want to fulfill their own interest. See? And with us, as African journalists, our interest should be the interest of Africa. pure and simple. So always keep that in mind. So when a Western media is talking about propaganda, ask yourself, what about your own propaganda in the Western media that is outlying propaganda? Western media that is so contemptuous of your intelligence that is actually telling you within the same story that they're getting information from the U.S. Defense Department. How insulting could that be? So why didn't they get information from the Russian Ministry of Defense as well? Why didn't they get the information from the China's Ministry of Defense as well? Think about that. Could they do
Yes.
a story condemning Western propaganda in Africa and then quoting from China's Ministry of Defense? Of course not. But it's so deep-seated in their mind that they don't even see that they can just insult us so blatantly and so open.
Wow. Okay. Before you go any further, I think this is one book I would unreservedly advertise for people to actually get. It's called Manufacturing Hates: How African Was Demonized in the Western Media. And the reason for showcasing the book is it actually points to this piece that we're actually talking about, how it is, crafted. And in the sense that, let me not take your thunder. Could you please explain your motivation for writing it? That'd probably be the best way to, segue to our next story.
Even as a kid, uh, born in Uganda, but really came to political consciousness in Tanzania.
Okay.
When my family was living in Tanzania during the time of Julius Nyerere, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Tanzania, the education system was really consciousness uplifting. As you know, Nyerere was one of the most prominent Pan-Africans, So I started reading newspapers in Tanzania. I started reading Western media as well. I'll go to the British Library. I'll go to the U.S. Information Services. I think that's what it was called. I think it's still
Yeah,
called that.
USIS. Yep.
And I noticed that when they're referring to Africa, it's always tribal, right? Always backward. So even as a kid, you see that they're trying to make a distinction between Africans and the West, between Africans and Europeans. So that really bothered me a lot. Obviously, as a 12-year-old, you're not equipped intellectually to critique that. Just know there's something wrong. It was only many years later I'd come to the United States. I already did my undergrad in economics at Syracuse. And then what I found, I was always writing letters to the editor, complaining, about how Africa was depicted, how Haitians were depicted and all that. So then friends convinced me and said, listen, you should just become a journalist. So I went back to school. I went to Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and I did my master's in journalism there. And then I started this, which has now become a book. I did it initially as my thesis at the Graduate School of Journalism. And even from that time onwards, I noticed the resistance, even as a student, because my paper had been accepted to be published in a publication called Columbia Journalism Review. Very excited about it. And then they ended up not publishing it. And obviously, I found out because essentially they were afraid of how the New York Times would react to publishing that, right? Because I went to their archives and I found letters exchanged between editors in the New York Times here in New York and reporters that sent to Africa. And the racism, you would expect, many of them harbored racism towards Africa, but it was so explicit. Not only the racism, which you can expect, but manufacturing scenes, incidents that never happened in Africa, just because they wanted to maintain that racist image of Africa. So, for example, I found letters written by reporters that they sent to Africa, to the editors in New York, complaining, in one case, why did somebody insert an image of Nigerians dressed in grass leaf skirts in his article? He never saw it, he never wrote it, and yet by the time the article was published in the New York Times, there it was, manufactured out of thin air, concocted by editors of the New York Times, sitting in New York City. you know, so obviously, that's just one example of the critique that I have in the book, and not surprisingly, the book, of course, was not reviewed by the New York Times.
No, of
It
course
was only
not.
reviewed by 3 outlets. And now my own publisher, even though the book was selling well, is not promoting my book. So I'm fighting to get the copyrights back so I can find a publisher who is brave, who is not afraid of the New York Times, so we can get this information out. To show to you that this propaganda in disinformation is not a one-way street. It's not, because I have the evidence to show that historically, they even made up things which never happened in Africa and published it as something that was happening in Africa.
I mean, speaking of the book, the last time I checked, there were 2 copies on Amazon. So if you're lucky, you might
Now,
just
once I
get
get the copyright, we will find a brave publisher, and whoever wants a book will have access to the book.
Okay. So yeah, and again, speaking of bravery, we go to for our next story, next and final story. We go to the Horn of Africa, and it's titled "Another Africa War Looms," and it's from one of your favorite publications, The Economist. It's titled "Africa: Another African War Looms." An agreement 2 years ago halted a bloody conflict in Ethiopia, but sowed the seeds of a new one. And the story is filed by Fatasi and Fagota. The soldier squints through his binoculars. They can see us, he wants, pointing to a silhouette of 2 figures on a hill in the distance. The men in his line of sight are soldiers from Eritrea, but the hill is in Tigray, a semi-autonomous region in northern Ethiopia. Eritrean soldiers control a significant chunk of Ethiopian territory on the continent, in places reaching as far as 10 kilometers inside it. And a peace agreement was signed by Ethiopian government and the TPLF, that's the Tigrayan People Liberation Force, on November 2nd, 2022, stopped the fight in Tigray, but it did not settle the conflict between Tigray and the war's 2 other main parties, Eritrea and the militias from Amhara. 2 years on, that omission helped explain why Mr. Abdi faces fresh insurgency at home and a potential war with Eritrea. These new pressures threaten to further destabilize the Horn of Africa, which is riven by tensions between several states and will-be states, and is facing fallout from a catastrophic civil war next door in Sudan. Your initial take before I read the next piece.
Well, I mean, this is would be catastrophic, of course, if they go back to open war.
Yeah.
So I'm very concerned about what is being reported here. I think personally, I think a lot of the situation in that part of the continent would be resolved if the Eritrean ruler, if his regime, his reign ends at some point. It has been there too long. So that is what the constant has been.
Okay.
That is not to take away from any of the damages that
Mr. Abdi caused.
that Abiy, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy, his militarism has also caused, right? Leading to that catastrophic war with the Tigray region, which indeed they signed the peace deal. So if they went back to open war, that would be catastrophic, absolutely. So it should be of concern to many people. I think it's going to be difficult to have long-lasting stability in that region, so long as the Eritrean leader, Afwerki, remains there. He's been there too long. I mean, 36 years almost. That's just too long for any country, let alone in Africa. We can't have that system anymore, right?
Yep.
In this part of the 21st century. So that's my initial number one concern. Number two, of course, warfare would just be catastrophic because we already have
Sudan,
right?
Congo.
We have instability in South Sudan. As you said, we have Congo, another outright full hostilities will just be catastrophic. And the people who suffer are not even the soldiers, right? If
Yeah.
the fighting was just confined to soldier, that would be terrible, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
But
In skill.
the
Yeah.
victims are not even soldier to soldier.
Women and
Probably
children.
99% of the victims are always going to be civilians
Mm.
who are killed, who are massacred,
Mm.
who are raped, who are starved. So we must be concerned about the situation and hope it does not deteriorate to full-scale war, because then you're going to have Tigray region with Eritrea fighting, or perhaps even the Ethiopian state itself
Mm-hmm.
joining with the Tigray region to fight against Eritrea, and then you have the Amhara region that has its own conflict with both the Tigray region as well as the
The
central
Ethiopians.
government in Ethiopia. So
Yeah.
this is something that is brewing. It could be a catastrophic situation.
Okay. Let me read the fine. There's a piece here I was looking out for. Yeah, here. Perhaps more worrying for the wider Horn of Africa is the breakdown in relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Soon after coming to power in 2018, Mr. Abiy engineered a Nobel Prize-winning rapprochement with Isaias Afwerki, Eritrean's aging dictator who fought a bloody war with Ethiopia in the late 1990s. Much of that fighting back then had been along Tigrayan border, leading to enmity between the Eritreans and the TPLF. When the war broke out again in Tigray in 2020, Mr. Abiy and Mr. Isaias joined forces to crush their common foe. Eritrean forces proceeded to commit some of the conflict's most worst atrocities. One flashpoint might be the disputed territories in Western Tigray for nearly 4 years. Hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans were forced to flee from their homes, and they have been stuck in limbo in other parts of the region. Where's it? The peace deal 2 years ago was supposed to ensure Ethiopia's warring parties could mend such rifts through further negotiation rather than violence. But no such talks has materialized. The agreement has failed to evolve into a proper peace deal, said American diplomats. For now, it's no more than a ceasefire, one that could easily collapse.
Okay, so obviously the problem is now they're quoting an American diplomat, right? No, but it's not by accident. It's because
They
there's
evolved.
no African leader who carries the kind of weight to be respected that could actually weigh in and come to that region and say, there's no Nyerere, right?
Yep.
There's no Mandela,
Yep.
there's no Nkrumah, who could say, Abiy, Afwerki, let's sit down. You see?
Yep.
And that is why they, of course, can quote a U.S. official who now becomes the prominent player in a situation like this. Whereas in the 1970s, if you remember, when we were dealing with the fight against white minority rule
In South Africa.
in South Africa, in what was then Rhodesia, in Angola,
In Namibia.
in Mozambique, Western diplomats, they would fly to Africa. Who would they fly to go and see? It would be Nyerere, Kaunda,
Yep.
and those leaders of what they call the frontline states. You see? So now, where's the frontline states to resolve the remaining or the new crisis that we have in Africa? It's not there. The frontline states was not something initiated by Western leaders. No. These were Africans who sat down and said, we have a problem. How shall we tackle it? They formed the frontline states. They mobilized African support. They mobilized African resources, and they succeeded.
And they spoke with
Right?
one voice.
So we need perhaps the kind of new leaders in countries like Senegal. They still have some moral compass, correct?
Correct? Yeah.
They have not been associated with major crimes of corruption, embezzling, committing massacres, right?
Yes.
So if the president of Senegal says, I would like to become a mediator in this crisis, I think he would get the respect. I
Of
would
course.
rather have him be quoted in these types of articles than some mysterious U.S. diplomat when we know the U.S. agenda in the region might differ with what is best in the interest of Africa, you see?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm suggesting. We need Africans that can still be respected to step up to the plate. And I imagine the leader in Senegal is dealing with a lot of situations that he inherited, you see?
Mm-hmm.
But I think they should still be able to find the time, right,
Yeah.
to devote in the interest of peace and stability in other parts of Africa. That would impact a large part of the continent and indirectly, his own country as well. So, for example, we have also the newly elected leader in Botswana. They still have relatively clean hands.
True.
So him and the leader of Senegal, if they were to make a joint statement, I think it
Will
would
carry some weight. Yeah.
And then we can build from there. Those are the kind of approaches that we need to many of the crises that we face in Africa. We have to be initiators and not always just followers, like blind people, you see?
There's one last part in that on that article I wanted to bring your attention to. It's here. Sign up to Analyzing Africa, a weekly newsletter that keeps you informed, that keeps you in the loop about the world's youngest and least understood continent.
Yeah, I mean, what else is new? If they're taking advantage of our resources, our minerals, why would they not take advantage of that opportunity as well? And that goes back to what I just said. We have to be the initiators. When we see change in their own countries, we also have to ask ourselves, what can we do differently to take advantage of changes in their own countries, even including the election of a Donald Trump? As detestable as he may be, how can we reorient our politics and our policies to take advantage of that opportunity? If it's only there for 4 years, and after 4 years, we see what to do again. We're always just sitting back. Oh, what are they going to do for us? What are they going to do against us? What are they? Come on now, wake up. Do something for yourself. And that's our problem.
Don't be the proverbial stones that things happen to.
Absolutely. Oh, is Trump going to be a danger to Africa? No. The question should be, what can Africa do to take advantage of Trump? We're not as helpless or hopeless as, they've convinced so many of us to believe. We have the resources.
Yeah, we do.
And they want the resources, whether it's Trump or anybody else in the White House.
So make a deal. Make a deal with the art of the deal maker. And yes, Comrade was saying earlier the story of the Horn of Africa. There's a book, The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa: Money, War, and the Business of Power, written by Alex de Waal. And it's a very, very insightful book.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but I respect.
Alex Waal.
I respect the Waal tremendously.
Yeah, he did a brilliant. I've read the Somali part. I've read the South Sudan part. I am on now to the Ethiopian part. And yeah, he does a brilliant, tracing the money, the people who come in who, set people against each other. He is on the money. He is on the money. Again, the title of the book is The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa, Money, War, and the Business of Power, Alex DeVore. And so we've come to the end of this week's episode of African News Review. Again, with me was Comrade Milton Allimadi. And Comrade, last words? Last words.
I love being in Africa. I'm very proud to say that. I wake up so excited every day, as an African. The possibilities of what we can accomplish for our fellow sisters and brothers, Africana people globally, gives me much excitement every day. I'm never disappointed. And I think that, our young people should also have that kind of approach. Yes, there are very demoralizing situations in many African countries. But it is not always going to be that way. It was never always that way, you see? And that is where the importance of history comes in. I feel the way I am is because I've had time to learn much of our history. So many Africans that succumb to white supremacist inferiority complexes because they don't know the history.
True.
Right? First of all human beings originated from what is now called Africa. It was not Africa before. Africa, that's not even really, you can't say an African word because Africa did not exist, right? But what I'm saying is, the region of the world now known as Africa is where human beings originated from.
Correct.
Had they not left about 100,000 years ago, everybody would look like you and I. Other so-called races came into being from the people who left what is now called Africa. So how can they be inferior to anybody when in fact they gave birth to everybody else, whether
exactly.
Asian, whether European, and all that. So that's number one. Number two, they built the great civilization of Kemet, aka ancient Egypt.
Yep.
And that was not like an outlier or something that happened by accident. No, because to some extent, they replicated those civilizations in West Africa, right? Ghana, Mali, Songhai, you name it, right? Before even a single European country existed, many of them were already building civilizations, right? So once you know this history, it will make you realize, wow, the current challenges we are facing was manufactured by somebody and imposed on us. So we can undo it and move to a better space. That is why history is very important. So read your history, become much more informed. That in itself will make you a better person. And then once you're a better person, you are much more knowledgeable. You can start engaging in the right type of activities to uplift fellow Africans. So that would be my parting words for today.
Mine would be, this week would have been the birthday of the African author and poet Chinua Achebe. And one of his famous quotes is, for a long time, the history of the hunt has been glorifying the hunters. For now, the lions have decided to tell their story of what the hunt is, which is what we're doing here on the African News Review, is telling the story. Like you said earlier, stop waiting for what they're going to do. You do something, be much more proactive. So happy birthday to, posthumously, of course, to the late, great Chinua Achebe. And
represent the ancestor.
yes. And so until next week, it is good night and God bless.
See you next week.
See you next week.